Hey, deserving listeners, I'm going to continue watching Tiff's video here, talking about the relationship between Tiff and Mildred. Let's watch.
And it's something a lot of people cannot understand until they're actually walking in those shoes. And at the time, she broke up with me at least 50 times. You see me talk about it on the show. Not the other way around, you know? Like, it wasn't me that was constantly breaking with her. It was her that was breaking up with me all the time. And after researching this...
Oh, interesting. I would have thought that Tiff would have broken up with her some of the time. So, according to Tiff's account, Mildred was the one breaking up with Tiff a lot. Okay, that's interesting. Interesting.
Regardless of what any person does or whatever the reasons are, breaking up with someone 50 times and taking them back and discarding them and bringing them back and discarding them is abuse in itself.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, can someone break up with someone repeatedly and have it not be abusive? Yeah, but it can absolutely be abusive. The other example that we've seen on reality TV is with Big Ed and Liz. We can't know if that's edited that way. We can't know if it's played up for cameras. We can't even really know if what's being presented to us is representative of their relationship. But what we have heard from the two of them is that Big Ed, will break up with Liz often. And the way that it looks that Ed is the one with those historical issues of trauma and this deep pain, and then a very self-assured attacking coming from all sorts of angles to Liz. And then when Liz is broken down and drawing a boundary, eventually he's just like, okay, I'm done with you. And we heard that infamous phone call, if you're familiar, where Liz drove a male coworker home. Even after asking Ed if it was okay, Ed said it was okay, which she shouldn't have to ask him for permission to do that anyway. But then after Liz dropped him off, the phone call allegedly was after that point, and Ed's really going after Liz and calling her a lot of names, and Liz is crying and saying, please don't, say that about me. And I think that was one of the times that Ed would have broken up with her. So absolutely, abusers can use breaking up as a tool, as a way of controlling the other person. And if you've been sufficiently brainwashed and gaslit, and you might have your own historical attachment issues, when that happens, especially as it will happen so quickly, there can be this vacuuming effect, this like sucking effect of just like, no, don't leave. And then you end up scrambling as a victim. It's like, okay, I'll be better. I'll do whatever you want. And it sounds like maybe something like that happened with Tiff.
Here I come back around thinking everything is my fault. And I try even harder just to get discarded again.
Yeah, and if this is even close to accurate, Tiff's account, it becomes part of the repertoire of the abuser. If the victim tries to assert themselves in any way, then it can become a way of eliminating that assertiveness in the victim, of saying, how come you're doing this to me? The perpetrator will say that, like, you know how I feel about those sorts of things. It's like you don't even love me anymore. And as a victim, in the beginning, you might start out and say, it's okay for me to assert myself. All I'm asking is to hang out with my friends on Saturday night. What's the big deal? And over time, it's just easier to give in. You're just like, it's such a headache to go, even though I kind of know I'm right. It's just such a bother. I mean, it'd be great to see my friends, but it's so much worse. I have to deal with a partner that's for 3 weeks holding it over my head and ruining our lives. Fine, I just won't see my friends. And then you start even potentially convincing yourself, well, maybe I am kind of selfish. And then the abuse cycle goes down that road.
No matter what I did, it was never enough. I was never enough. And I do believe that relationships tend to mirror what we go through as children, as all of us do. So Sam gave me insight into realizing this during our trial marriage, that I am enough no matter what I do.
Yeah, I didn't comment on that at the time because I wasn't really sure if that's what I was seeing. But hearing Tiff say this makes sense, that the trial marriage for Tiff was liberating, in that for Sam, seemingly being a lot more differentiated, one of the most differentiated people on the show, I think, hard to tell, but looked that way to me, that Sam was assertive but not abusive. Sam would say, hey, I don't, the whole dog conversation, we were shown the main fight between the two of them, but then we heard later on that they did manage to make up and had a fine platonic trial marriage for 3 weeks. And so for Tiff, they might be like, oh, so even though I was overreacting, I think Tiff might have even said that, I am seeing that it's okay for me to be that way. Like Tiff might have, actually, I don't think obviously I wouldn't have known this at the time, but Tiff might have come out swinging, so to speak, not physically, but really strong reactivity against Sam because there was an indication that maybe Sam might not like Tiff's dog. And Tiff felt like they needed to really fight fire with fire, predicting that fire was going to happen. And then Sam was not fire. Sam was more differentiated and caring and compassionate while being assertive. Sam didn't back down. So, hey, I can't tell you how I'm going to feel about the dog. That's all my point. I'm not saying I don't like the dog. I'm just saying I have feelings and that's okay. And that's not a threat to you. It just is what it is. It seems like maybe over time, Tiff was like, oh, wait, so I don't have to fight fire with, so other people can be respectful while being assertive. And Sam's treating me differently than the way Mildred. Wow, this is different. Maybe I'm not so crazy like I believed from Mildred's abuse. Maybe I do have rights. Maybe I do have freedom. And what's going on? And it's interesting to think about. I didn't ever thought about on this show that you would have that opportunity for victims to contrast a relationship as a way to liberate themselves. Sounds like that's what happened for Tiff.
But unfortunately, I was still in a toxic vortex and couldn't see myself out of this vicious cycle.
But sounds like Tiff is saying, I was still in the brainwashed state, but maybe later on Tiff started to, or maybe it planted a seed. It's what we often talk about in therapy. When I first started out as a therapist, I worked with a lot of people. We call them multi-problem families, meaning that not only did the child have depression or PTSD or ADHD, but you also had the child suffer from something else. Also, the child was being bullied at school. Also, the family was suffering from poverty. It was a single-parent family. They were having trouble getting health care. There were 3 kids that were fighting against each other. The community was unsafe, school problems with the system, lots of issues. And so with these kinds of families, with some of these individuals, it was a lot to ask for therapy to take hold right away because in their life they were continuing to incur trauma and difficulty and stress. So what we would talk about often amongst ourselves was that we're planting seeds that might grow in the future. And sometimes we would stick with families long enough that we would actually see those seeds grow into something. It's a way of reassuring yourself as a helper that you're actually helping when there's no evidence that you're helping, because sometimes there wasn't. A lot of times you'd see families, individuals get worse over time, not because of you, but seemingly. It's hard to know, but it didn't seem like it was because of our therapy. It was because things in their life were getting worse and it was taking a toll. So for Sam and Tiff, that relationship might have planted a seed that later grew for Tiff.
To be in these relationships where you keep on getting discarded, gaslit, disposed, harmed by words, guilt-tripped and controlled. It forms complex PTSD and does damage to the brain. It's a real thing. It's abusive.
Yeah, complex PTSD is a real thing. And it does theoretically, in all likelihood, change one's neurology over time. There are some limited studies demonstrating what Tiff is referring to, but not for everyone, and it's hard to measure because our technologies in measuring neurological change and identifying even what that change means is extremely limited at this stage of our technology. So, but it stands to reason that over time, habitually, if you're in a state, then it's much easier to engage in those thought processes. If you're in a constant state of being afraid and trying to accommodate and not acknowledging your feelings because you're not safe to, then over time, with repetition, eventually that just happens automatically, even if you're not in the face of danger. You might be with a new person who's actually, like Sam, who isn't an actual threat, but you engage in the fear and then the response as a habit because neurologically you have those well-worn paths in your thinking and your automatic responses and in your interpretation of things. So absolutely. And trauma from domestic violence, from intimate partner violence, often will result in legit PTSD, whether we call it complex or not. Like a common example is that the perpetrator comes home from work and closes the door a little harder than other times. And because as a victim, you're so attuned to the mood of the perpetrator, you notice those things. If you're not in a situation like that, you might not note, at the very least consciously, how loud someone closes the door when they get home. So the victim is reading a book, door shuts a little faster, maybe even you pick up on the pace that the perpetrator is walking at, and instantly your body is thrown into fight or flight. And then later on, even if you're not in the relationship anymore, you hear a door shut a little loud, and your body goes into fight or flight. That's evidence of potential for PTSD. It could just be regular trauma reactivity, but what happens over time is if you have frequent fight or flight reactions to stimuli and you're being abused, eventually you start to shut down a lot of things. So PTSD is a very complicated disorder. I believe from last time I checked, it has the most descriptors, the most criteria. It takes up the most pages in the DSM, and it's complicated. So it's not just reactivity. It's a lot of other things that occur within the personality in response to the constant triggers. When because if you have these constant triggers eventually, and there's no way out of that, you have to develop ways of coping with that. Some people will shut down. Some people will shut themselves off from the world. Some people will be hypervigilant and constantly, looking around, trying to put out fires before they happen. And so that the whole syndrome of PTSD will look like that. And I wouldn't be surprised if Tiff did develop that, as Tiff is stating.
It's abusive, and I was constantly in a state of defending myself, always in fight, flight, freeze, or fall mode. No matter what I did not have a safe space. As if I left, I was shamed. We saw how that played out in the Ultimatum when Aussie left Sam. And she turned the negative around and blamed Aussie and victimized Aussie.
Yeah. Again, I want to check in for a second and say that I've been around the block enough times clinically and personally to know that if I were to investigate the entire situation, talk with Mildred, talk with third parties, that I would have a more rich description. All of that future unknown data might align with what Tiff is saying, and some of it might not. And I might discount the non-alignment of data, or I might incorporate it and say, oh, okay. So I just want to be clear that I can't tell what's really happening. There's a lot of signs, and I use this platform as a way of using it as a jumping off point. I certainly support Tiff, absolutely, in speaking their voice, and especially if Tiff is accurate in identifying themselves as a victim, then absolutely, Tiff deserves a lot of credit, a lot of support. Tiff's very courageous for speaking out. But I've been around the block enough to know that I just can't tell from public statements from public figures.
And although Aussie has childhood trauma to work on, as we all do, Aussie was also expressing boundaries. Something I did not have during the show. In fact, I developed such a thick skin because I had to. Because I had to go through the blunt force of Mildred all of the time to a point where I started to become numb.
Yeah, it sounds credible, right? It doesn't look like Tiff is distorted or lying. So it's a lot of data in the column demonstrating what Tiff is talking about, supporting what Tiff is talking about. And so what Tiff, I think, is pointing to right now is, look, Aussie has the ability to draw boundaries in a way that maybe I originally did, but due to my ongoing chronic experience with abuse, I had lost that ability to draw a boundary. And a part of that was because I was numb. So often what's happening for victims in this situation is they're not technically numb. They are being harmed. But often when we have a feeling, like think about if you had chronic pain. Often, if you've never had a pain, like let's say right now you've never had a pain in your spine, and all of a sudden you get a sharp pain in your spine, it would really distract you if it was sufficient. You would be, whoa, what's going on? And you would have a hard time paying attention at work or watching a TV show. You'd just be like, oh, what is going on? You extend that over time, and the pain, you're diagnosed, you go through treatment, and the physicians say, there's really nothing we can do, that kind of thing. And so you're now living with this pain, and it's frequent. It's still painful and demoralizing over time, but it doesn't alert you because you're used to it. It's something that it's like, well, there's that thing again. It's depressing, honestly, to feel the pain. It's not alerting. It doesn't, wait, what's going on? So when you are first experiencing abuse, you're, hey, what's going on? Fight or flight. Let's fix this. Over time, your body and mind just become like, well, here it happens. So what's the point in feeling the feelings? It's just going to bother. There's no sense in acting like I can change it because I can't. It might even be all my fault. So, let's just not pay it. And the numbness is one ignoring the feelings to the point where they might even not be consciously aware of the feelings, but the feelings are still there. It's not like they're not afraid, they're not being harmed. They don't feel, they in all likelihood are being harmed. There is dissociation, which is another thing. And there are different definitions of it. There's clinical dissociation. There's like the psychoanalytic version. And I guess what I'm describing is more the psychoanalytic version. But the clinical version can actually result in one distancing themselves from victimization such that they don't necessarily encode the memories or experience the things. Anyway, so Tiff is talking about that.
And you wonder why I acted the way I did towards Sam right away. But there she went, introducing me a gentle energy. I didn't have to have a guard up, because in the relationship with Mildred, I constantly had a guard.
Yeah, so Tiff is confirming what I was suspecting earlier, because Tiff was referring to that.
Guard up all the time, because I never knew what to expect within living within her chaotic life. One of the biggest things I've learned post-relationship in my healing journey is that one person can tell who is the abuser is by seeing that the abuser is constantly provoking fights.
Yeah, it depends. It's hard to know. You could see a scenario where you have a legit perpetrator and victim, and in that snippet of time, you absolutely see the victim provoking. You can't see that. But generally speaking, the victim is trying to survive. They're not trying to start a fight. They might participate in the fight. They might even escalate the fight, but they're not looking to fight. They're terrified of fights. Often their entire life is oriented around pleasing the perpetrator, not provoking the perpetrator. So they're not particularly interested in provoking, right? Whereas the perpetrator is much more comfortable with that, much freer, feels much more entitled. And they use provocation, depending on the profile, but seemingly if Tiff is being accurate here, the Mildred type of abuser will use provocation, again, as a way of controlling, as a way of beating someone down. The way to think about it, the way I see it, if Tiff and Mildred did have an abusive relationship, and Mildred was being abusive to Tiff, is that the way to think about it is that there'll be these little indications to the Mildreds of the world that the Tiffs of the world are disapproving or moving away. The abuser is often driven by trying to manage abandonment, trying to manage rejection. And it sounds weird, but you can have very mild conversations. Like you can even have this happened to me personally. I don't think I've ever talked about this. This is a long time ago, but I was talking with a friend, and I was just kind of brainstorming different lifestyle changes that I might make in my life. And I remember saying something like, I want to cut back on red meat or something like that. And I was just thinking, maybe I should cut back on red meat or maybe not eat meat at all or something like that. And pretty quickly, my friend or acquaintance started to attack me, started to point out all these reasons why I shouldn't stop, let's just say red meat, that I should eat red meat. And, I don't know what she said, but it would have been in the camp of something like, well, you can't get all your nutrients unless you have red meat. And, red meat is really good. And, you like red meat and everything will be fine. And just very frantic arguing against my just random brainstorm. And also I'm thinking, what is it to you? You seem personally interested in me not making this change, it doesn't impact. What's the problem here? Okay, I hypothesized later on, given a lot of other data points, that the individual was threatened by what I had said. They had perceived it as a potential road to rejection because she ate red meat. And it doesn't make any sense logically, but when you have an itchy trigger finger on the interpretation of rejection and then the solution of control, then you see rejection where it's not really happening. Me saying I don't want to eat red meat, I don't even remember if that's what it was, something like that. She interpreted it as, well, that's one less thing we share in common. I'm already teetering on the fear that he's going to reject me. And this is, I have to, so I feel a feeling of like, oh no, what if we can't share that together? And it was so far afield. It wasn't, we didn't bond around whatever it was. It had nothing to do with our relationship. It was just different from her, right? And so she felt that fear, I'm hypothesizing, and then her solution was control, because that was modeled to her, trial and error. She learned that's the only way or whatever. And so she was trying, and I remember as we were talking about my just random brainstorm that I was coming up with over brunch, I remember I started to feel afraid. As she's starting to get me to do this, I'm thinking, why is my heart pounding? Why am I, who cares? Okay, fine, I'll eat red meat. You know, it's that kind of dynamic. You amp that up or you project that down the road a couple years, and you have someone that has done that over and over and over again and has effectively eliminated all of my free will and my agency and has full control over everything, what I eat, who I hang out with, what I say, how I dress, everything. Because every perceived threat to attachment, every perceived rejection sign is instantly react to with control and with all these attacks, right? So from the outside or even from the victim side, it just kind of looks like the perpetrator loves to provoke. They want to be in fights. And that's not the way to look at it, because if you are fully obedient, you know, you hand yourself over completely to the perpetrator, then in all likelihood, the provocation will stop. And that's the temptation for the victim. It's like, okay, I can try to fight back, which won't work and will just escalate the abuse and my own confusion. And I also don't want to be rejected. I have my own attachment needs that this person fills. So I don't want that. Or I can put aside my personality, which sucks, but the abuse will go away. We'll have nice times. She'll be nice to me again, and everything will be fine. Okay, I'll just let go of who I am, whether you consciously know that or not. Now, for the rare psychopathic perpetrator of intimate partner violence, they might wake up in the morning and literally say, I'm going to provoke my partner because I want to, because I don't care about their feelings and I want to manipulate them. There are those people. They're rare, though. Okay, most people are the way I'm describing, where they feel they have a reaction and then their solution is to abuse and control.
A typical tactic that these kind of people do is they smear campaign you and throw out every single possible bomb they can to make you look like an absolute horrible person before you tell your truth, so the world can be distracted from a miserable reality of who they really are.
Yeah, this is not universal, of course, but it is common for abusers because they have more agency and they see the writing on the wall sometimes that the victim is maybe starting to talk with other people or someone else gets involved. A common example, a common profile, this isn't universal, of course, but one that I've seen a lot is the perpetrator will go too far with the victimization. They might literally punch the victim in the face so that there's a lot of bruising, a lot of visible evidence of the abuse. And the perpetrator might even feel bad about it. That can happen. Perpetrators can feel shame. The way that perpetrators are framed on the internet is not that way. And I'm not saying you're supposed to feel compassion for perpetrators, and I'm not saying you're supposed to go back to the perpetrators. A lot of times, again, I should be clear, because some of the time people will email me and say, wow, your conceptualization of some perpetrators has helped me to have compassion for my abusive spouse. But I don't know what to do because I don't want to stay with them, but I know that they're only doing it because of their traumas, this sort of thing. And what I want to be clear is that just because you can conceptualize in a compassionate way as to why the abuser is being abusive does not mean you need to stay with the abusive person. I am an expert when it comes to perpetration of abuse. Give me enough time with someone, I'll probably be able to confidently hypothesize as to which type it is, whether it's the type that might provoke some compassion for the person. It's based on their traumas and distortions. It's not really a choice that they make. I mean, they make choices and they're responsible for it, but there's some emotional trauma reasons as to why they are interpreting the world that way and why they're doing things like that. So I can tell the difference, or I can confidently hypothesize between that and between a psychopath, antisocial person who literally wakes up in the morning and gets off on harming other people. Not all psychopaths are like that, but some are. So I can tell the difference. And when I have encountered these people in my personal life, and I've encountered people on both sides, I will do everything in my power to get away from these people. I don't stick around these people. If I'm treating them, I stick around them. But I have a professional boundary. I have power in that relationship, right? I have the ability to terminate with them. I also have the power of my clinical license and my clinical expertise. If push came to shove and the police were called, my account would probably hold more weight, depending, So I know that, and the perpetrator knows that, and so I don't feel victimized. I don't feel unsafe, generally speaking, because clients can make you feel unsafe sometimes. But in my personal life, as soon as I detect it, and I have detected it in my life, I will see it from a mile away because of my experience with it. I'll be like, oh, wait, that person that I'm getting close to, or that person I'm working with, or that person that is a friend of a friend, they have some red flags there. I don't know, but it kind of looks this way. And as soon as I have little tests in my mind, it's like, okay, keep an eye. And if this happens, then run. And if this happens, then maybe you weren't right. And over time, I will start to see things, more red flags, and I will very quickly and very definitively, without any question in my mind, without any guilt, I will distance myself from that person. If I can help it, I don't go after the person and say, you're abusive, get out of my life, because that doesn't usually extract me from them. That will just potentially entwine us more. And we could imagine what could happen from after that. That would engage me more. What I do is I gray rock, if you've heard of that technique, where you basically just become non-interesting to the abusive person. Essentially you remove yourself from their radar. You're not a problem in their life, but you're also not really there. And you're not really manipulatable, but you're not actively opposing, which gives them something to push against. You're basically just non-existent. And over time, they stop targeting you and they stop needing you. They stop wanting you for anything because you're not meeting their needs either direction, either to meet their needs attachment-wise or to meet their needs to oppose someone. They have those needs of contact, right? If I can't contact you in a good way, I'll contact you in a bad way. And so if they can't contact you at all, and it's hard, you have to be I'm an expert on this, not only in my professional life, but one could argue that I've gotten good at it in my personal life as well, because I've had a number of years on this planet. And when you're an expert on this sort of thing, because I specialized in treating perpetrators when I was 27 years old and beyond. So it's been since then. And nothing will teach you about domestic violence, intimate partner violence more than actually treating the perpetrators and hearing the stories from their victims, people who are actually convicted. The police were called, they go to court, they're convicted. These individuals usually have had a whole lifetime of abusing people by the time they actually get the police called on them and by the time they actually get convicted. So you learn a lot, and boy, did I learn a lot. It really is complicated, and there's so many nuances to it. Anyway, so I've had a lot of practice, and for me, it's not easy. It has a lot of uncertainty, but I do not stick around, and I have compassion for them. I'm like, oh, yeah. Sometimes I know exactly where their traumas come from. I might even know who traumatized them growing up. I might have even been there when we were younger. I don't know. And I'll say, oh, it breaks my heart. And it's not my job to stick around with these people. I only get one time on this planet. I'm not going to stick around being abused. I'm not going to be stressed out. I got better shit to do. And it sucks that the universe is organized in a way that those individuals who are traumatized, the most abandoned, the most harmed, are the most plagued emotionally, and thus causing the most damage around them. They're causing a lot of damage around them. They didn't choose that childhood. Mildred didn't choose to have that childhood. It's a crime on humanity that those kinds of things happen to begin with, right? We can do a lot more to alleviate those and to mitigate those and reduce those, minimize those kinds of problems by having programs that tax dollars pay for to help parents, young parents or new parents, and help people with drug addiction, help people with trauma. Having talk about a crime on humanity, the fact that we have so many people suffering from trauma and literally there's no access to treatment, or they don't have access to a competent treatment professional who knows what they're doing when it comes to trauma. So you want to talk about a crime on humanity. And if we did that, if we allocated the tax dollars, had those programs, and I'm not talking about whatever bill was passed recently in our federal government of like $10 billion or something dollars, it needs to be way, way more than that. And the benefits monetarily would be great because the effects, the downstream effects of trauma are so pervasive in our society. The amount of dropouts from school, the amount of future intimate partner violence, the amount of crime, the amount of child abuse. If we can nip it in the bud when the child is being raised, we can end the cycle of abuse that happens throughout the generations, right? So, just a little rant there, so I want to be clear that when I present a compassionate hypothesis, which I can't know, about Mildred, I am not saying that Tiff should stay with Mildred. If Mildred is abusive, and I have compassion for Mildred, and maybe Tiff could have compassion for Mildred, if I were in Tiff's shoes, I would run and I would say, no, I got better shit to do with my life. I'm not Mildred's therapist. And even if I was, I'm not going to stick around and be abused and wait 25 years for some recovery. Even if Mildred was really dedicated to it, it might take a long time. So yeah, I just want to be clear about that. Okay, well, let's adjourn there and tune in next time when I continue watching. And everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.